Good afternoon and welcome to everyone who's hopped on the call at this point. This is Kevin Williams from DreamSpring. I am our SBA program manager, and so I've been pretty heavily involved in our PPP program. With me today on the call, we have a couple other DreamSpring members, and I want to give them a brief chance to introduce themselves. So Gwen and Rachel, if you guys want to hop on and let them know who you are and what you do with the organization.
So this is Gwen Bonilla. I've been working with Kevin and Rachel closely on trying to get the process as smooth as possible for everybody. I'm a program administrator in Spring, and it's been a wild ride, but thanks for joining us, and hopefully these changes will be good news for most of you.
Thanks, Gwen. My name is Rachel Burgoyne. I'm the lending team manager with DreamSpring. Kevin, take it away.
Perfect. So the purpose of the call today, we are a couple of months into the second draw PPP loan program, and most folks have probably seen some announcements over the past couple of weeks here regarding changes being made to PPP. And so the point of the call today is to update you just really on the status of where things are, and then about the changes that have happened, because there are some substantive and important changes that have come out in the last couple of days here. And so we're going to be going through those in the call. A little overview. So our topics covered, I'm going to briefly just talk about PPP and where we're at. Most of you have applied, so you know about the process. I won't spend a lot of time on that. A few things we've learned, what's going on internally, and then just some FAQs. Throughout the call, if you have questions, you are welcome to put those in the chat. Gwen and Rachel might get back to them, but do realize we're going to have a designated time at the end of the call that's going to allow you to ask those questions. We'll go through them. I think the call is scheduled for an hour today. I'd be shocked if it went that long. When Rachel and I were scheduling this yesterday, I'd suggested about half an hour, but she knows I tend to be long-winded. So I think she bumped it out to an hour there. So we'll see if we can keep it kind of tidy, as I know we all have probably busy schedules. The overview is that right now, since probably about mid-January, we've been processing first and second draw PPP loans. And so first draw, meaning you haven't received a PPP loan yet. Second draw, meaning you might have gotten one previously and you're coming back for another. We get a lot of questions about the loan terms. Those are still the same as they've always been. It's 1% interest rate on a PPP loan, 60-month term, and they are eligible for forgiveness. Our experience has been that most of the loans will be forgiven, especially if you take the time just to properly document things. Currently, the PPP program is set to expire on March 31st of 2021. So that means that we need to not only have your application with us, but we need to have submitted to the SBA by that time. There's been a lot of conversation about whether that'll be extended further out down the road. And while that's possible, I wouldn't operate under that assumption. So organizationally, we are trying to make sure that everything we have and every client we can help is helped by March 31st of 2021. First FAQ I wanted to go over. One question we've been getting really regularly from people is, if I'm just getting a first draw PPP loan, can I apply for second draw now as well? And so maybe it's a client that either wasn't eligible previously, where the rules changes we're going to talk about in a minute. There are some people that can now qualify that couldn't under the old rules. And maybe they're wondering, okay, if I just got a PPP loan, or I'm just about to, I'm going to get a first draw, can I apply for a second draw as well? One of the pieces of the application, it's that second bullet point that's there. It says the applicant received a first draw Paycheck Protection Program loan, and before the second draw PPP loan is dispersed, will have used the full loan amount, including an increase of the first draw PPP loan only for eligible expenses. And so that's part of the second draw application. That's a box that every borrower has to initial. And so it's saying that you've used the full loan amount. So the simple answer here, without getting too granular in the forgiveness stuff, is that if you take a second draw right after receiving your first draw, it can actually cause problems with forgiveness. And so our plan for this, we do want to make sure that we're able to take care of clients. If you notice the language, it says before the second PPP loan is dispersed. It doesn't say before you apply. It doesn't say before you're approved. And so what we've been planning on doing is anyone who got a first draw recently, we'll be contacting you directly to talk through that for the options, because ideally we'd love to get you qualified for a second draw and then be able to disperse that at a time when it's not going to cause any problems for your loan forgiveness request. And so that was previously scheduled to happen this week. We were going to reach out to folks, but some of the changes that have happened with PPP have pushed that back a little bit, but do realize that's important to us and that's on our timeline. A brief overview or internal process, as we get a lot of questions for people where from your perspective, you put something in online and then you might not hear back from us for a day or two, and then you'll get an automated email telling you about statuses. So I wanted to quickly go over what things look like for our team. So when you apply, your application goes into our application received queue, and it's initially reviewed by a loan officer. If everything's correct, it moves forward to our final review stage. Before these changes to the loans, we were usually reviewing loans within about 2 days of receipt. So we're getting pretty well caught up. The new application and the new application process has pushed us back there a little bit, but I think we are going to be turning these around pretty quickly still. If the application doesn't have correct documentation, or there's incorrect information, it goes to a different queue that we call our technical assistance queue. And so in this queue is where we might start sending people some automated emails initially saying, hey, you didn't give us the right payroll information, or we need a photo of your ID, or things like that, where something wasn't uploaded properly the first time. So we'll start by sending some automated emails, and then if someone doesn't get back to us, usually we'll reach out directly. So if you see one of those emails that comes through that lets you know we need additional documents, it's a good idea to upload those quickly, as that immediately gets attached to your application. It gets flagged for our team to review it again, and so that's a good way to keep things moving forward. Once an application has gone through received, and if it needs to, technical assistance goes to final review, where our underwriting team does a quick check of things just to make sure that we don't have any math or data entry that's wrong that would cause issues for you later. And then we send it to the SBA. The SBA reviews the loan, and what's different about this time around is that sometimes they'll approve it, sometimes they'll decline it, and in other instances, they'll actually ask for additional documentation. Assuming the loan request is approved, then you're going to provide your bank account information, and we're going to move towards funding. So at that point, we'll send you some loan documents. You'll enter the account where you want to have things deposited. So that's the kind of overview. In order to keep your application moving forward, I think it's a really good idea to watch your email carefully. That's the easiest way for us to communicate with people given the volume that we're working on. We'd love to be able to have a one-on-one phone call with each borrower, but given that we have hundreds and hundreds of applications that are coming in per day, it's just harder to keep up with that. So if we send you an email letting you know what we need, do your best to read that carefully and get it back to us. Another FAQ is just about that TA stage. So it's saying you're getting an email asking for additional documents. Why do I need to provide more information? A lot of the times what will happen is maybe we just don't have exactly what we need based on what you uploaded the first time. Maybe you one of the documents, for example, is a proof of home address, and it needs to be within the last 60 days. And sometimes maybe you gave us a document from a year ago or a bank statement from last June. It just needs to be more current. So in that instance, you'd get an email saying, hey, you gave us an old bank statement. Can you give us a more recent one? So pretty simply, it just means that on first review, our team thinks they need something else. They'll let you know what that is. There's a link where you can upload things. It's pretty simple. It's very similar to the application process. The nice thing is it attaches it directly to your application for us, and it keeps things moving forward smoothly. Another thing that can happen this time around, and this has been confusing for some folks, it's actually surprising to us as well as a lender, is that this time it's possible that the SBA will not approve a request initially. And so what that means is either we're attempting to submit and we're getting a submission error. And so what that means is that when we try and send it over, the SBA just declines it immediately and sends it back to us and says something's wrong. This can be usually it's a data error. So it might be that when you entered your NICS code, you didn't look it up properly, or you had a typo in it, and it's actually not a real NICS code. And so we have to review, find out what the error is, and correct it. And a lot of the times these are just coming down to data entry things. It's also possible that there's this other error that comes back about EIN and SSN type do not match, but this stage can usually take a couple of days for us, but we go back and forth with SBA, get any errors corrected, and get it sent over to them. If this is happening, we don't need anything from you as a borrower. It's pretty straightforward. We work through that. Most of the times you won't even see an email regarding it if we don't need anything from you, but that's just something to be aware of, that does take some time. The next thing that's possible is an SBA hold. And this is essentially when the SBA declines the loan request. And there are different ways they can do this and different explanations. It's failed validation, not approved by the SBA, or further research required. In this instance, the SBA gives us one of about 100 different error messages that's possible, and says a range of things that they've identified for why they don't want to approve your application. In this instance, we're going to work with you to get those corrected. From what I've been seeing, I've worked on this process quite a bit. At least half the time, the SBA has some information wrong on their end. There's one of our clients, for example, that I know personally that I talk with on the phone probably once a quarter at least, that had an error that came back that says this applicant may be deceased, and they were unwilling to approve it based on that. And we knew that factually wasn't true. So we worked with our borrower, we collected some documentation, we sent it over to the SBA and resolved it. This process can take a little bit of time and it requires some back and forth. On the whole, the good piece is that the application can keep moving forward. So if you ever see an email that says the SBA has declined your request, I think some people kind of despair and don't want to move forward at that point. But we've actually had good success if you're able to show us that, for example, another common error is the business was not in operation as of February 15th, 2020. Usually we can just get some documentation and still move the request forward. So if you see one of those emails, that's what's going on. Nothing wrong necessarily, but it might require some extra effort on your part. So now the main point of the call. There's the updated 2483 SC and 2483 SD-SC applications. Not the most creative naming from the SBA here. Essentially what this is saying is for a Schedule C borrower. And so it's an applicant that is using a Schedule C tax return. Usually this is an independent contractor, a sole proprietor, self-employed individual, and then some single member LLCs as well. The main thing that's changed is just that there's a new calculation. The old calculation used to use line 31, which was net income. The new calculation uses line 7, which is gross income. What changes here is there were a lot of borrowers that were ineligible previously, where you might have been declined. We might have said, hey, unfortunately, just because you had a net loss last year, we can't get this approved for you. Now with line 7, gross income, most folks are able to be approved for at least something. And what's different as well is some people whose loan would have been smaller previously, where maybe you would have only gotten $1,000 or $2,000, are now eligible for $10,000. Within this, the maximum loan is still $20,833 per owner for one employee businesses. And so, for example, if you don't have any employees, even if line 7 shows $300,000 of gross income, your maximum loan amount is $2,833. But the really great piece of this is working off of gross income really helps out a lot of sole proprietors because it helps them cover more of their business expenses. Really, the SBA step back and say, okay, well, owner income is one piece, but what does this business need to survive to be able to move forward to get through this? And so that's why they shifted to using line 7. This has been a request from a lot of borrowers for a long time. And so we're very excited about being able to qualify more people. Another note here as well is that loan forgiveness is still going to be based off line 7 of your tax return, which is great because even if you're using this new calculation, you can probably be eligible for full forgiveness pretty easily. Outside of that, that's the only thing that changes. You shift one line over. If you have employees, you can still use line 7. It gets a little more complicated, but we usually take care of the math for you on that. Eligibility is the same otherwise. So you had to be in business last year. If it's a second draw loan request, you need to be able to show a 25% loss at some point, usually at the time of forgiveness there. And on the whole, it's just the same handful of questions you go through. And so it's just increased eligibility, increased approval amounts for a lot of Schedule C borrowers, which given the fact that we work with a lot of folks who are Schedule C borrowers, we're excited to see this change. Another FAQ, a lot of people are asking, okay, if I already applied with DreamSpring and I'm interested in using this updated application, do I need to apply again? So what happened is there used to be an old 2483 application and a 2483 second draw application. When they're coming out with this new calculation, there is a new application form. What that means is that we actually need some action from you if you want to use the updated application. When we step back from this, we thought it was going to be tedious for borrowers to start the process all over again, to cancel the request. And so we are strongly encouraging you to not cancel your request. Don't call in and say, well, I want to cancel and use the new form. You should have received an email yesterday on March 5th, about 5 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, inviting you to amend your existing application. So it's really simple. All it does is asks you a couple of different questions that are present on the 2483 SD-SC application or 2483 SC application. So just that new form, it asks you whatever questions are different. It doesn't ask you to upload any new documentation. A lot of the clients I've talked to so far have been able to complete it in just a couple of minutes. So if you want to change over to that, you're able to. There's also the option there if you say, oh, I just want to use the old version, I don't want to change things, you can select that as well. The reason I'm advising it's canceling and resubmitting is that really on your application, we've probably made some progress on it. So even if you might have applied earlier this week, we've probably checked off some of our internal to-do list items. You're ahead of other people in line. And what can happen is if you cancel and resubmit, you kind of go to the back of the queue. It's going to result in a longer process, longer time until you're approved. So you'll just go in and fill out that amendment if you'd like to use the new one. Really simple process. We've had, I think, 400 or 500 borrowers complete it so far, and it seems like it's going pretty well. Another question is, if I file a Schedule C return, are there reasons I wouldn't want to use this new form? So the 2483 SC. And it actually is worth noting that for some borrowers, it actually might be worth staying with your previous form type. So what this means is there's something that's called safe harbor protections, which this was a news story back in April of last year where they were finding out that there were a lot of big organizations and companies that were getting PPP loans. There was a news story where Harvard had gotten one. And a lot of people were saying, well, Harvard's got a lot of money. Why do they need this? And so safe harbor protection says that current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. That's one of the things that every borrower initials. If you're covered under safe harbor protections, the SBA is going to trust you when you make that, when you initial there, essentially. They're not going to ask any questions. You say, I need this loan. It's necessary for ongoing operations. They're never going to ask you another question about it. What's different about the 2483 SC form is that for a borrower with above $150,000 on line 7, so that's that gross income number, so maybe you did $180,000 of gross sales last year, you are no longer covered by safe harbor if you use the new form. What that means is it's possible the SBA will come back to you at some point and say, okay, was this request really necessary? And they might ask for some documentation for you to prove that. And so you'd want to have in mind that, okay, if you have above $150,000 on line 7, if you say yes to updating to your new form type, you want to go to this SC application, there might be some more questions that come from the SBA with time. For any borrower with less than $150,000 on that line, so line 7, I don't see any reason that you wouldn't update to this new form. So the only instance is where you're above 150K, you don't want to have any questions from the SBA later, you might just stick with the existing form just to keep things simple. There have been some other small changes in eligibility as well. So previously, if you had any delinquent or defaulted federal student loans, you would not be eligible for PPP. So we had a number of applicants that we had to decline for that previously. And so we've reached back out to them since, but what's great is that they are now eligible. That's no longer a disqualifying factor. Previously, the criminal history requirements were a bit more strict. Now the way it sits, they've loosened those a little bit. You can have a felony conviction. It just needs to be older than 1 year, except if it's related to fraud. So if it's a fraud-related felony, the conviction needs to be at least 5 years old. So that's going back through 2016 at this point. Any other felony can be, as long as it's a year out, you're fine there. And so that opens up eligibility for some folks as well. Another change is that ITIN borrowers are now eligible for PPP. So previously, only business owners with a social security number were eligible for PPP. Now you can have an individual taxpayer identification number. Usually, if you're an ITIN borrower, you know you're an ITIN borrower and you know what this means for you. So I won't get too much more granular there, but if you have any questions for the lending team, we're happy to talk through this, but you are now eligible. There's nothing you need to change about the application. You just use the basic form. Previously, anytime we submit an ITIN request, the SBA would just decline it for us and let us know they weren't eligible. That has changed, and so we're going to encourage you to apply now. Another FAQ is that this new 2043 SC application that just came out, one thing that was confusing initially is if you ever looked it up online, it's not our digital version, but the online version, it only lists sole proprietors, independent contractors, and self-employed individuals. And so there's this question of, okay, if I'm an LLC, can I use this new application? Luckily, we did get confirmation from the SBA yesterday that yes, any entity that files a Schedule C tax return is now eligible for the new loan calculation, which is great. The SBA gets kind of funny on this stuff, but they essentially say that if you fill out a If you fill out a Schedule C tax return, they kind of consider you to be a sole proprietor, even if you're registered as an LLC. I'm a little confused on that. I think internally we've been going back and forth with them on that, but the good piece to know is that you are eligible. You can use this new calculation that helps you qualify for more. Another question is, if I've already been funded, can I ask for an increase for either my first or second draw loan using this new calculation? So there was a little bit of questioning going back and forth for borrowers. For example, if I got a PPP loan in last June and there's this new calculation, can I increase my amount? Or even for people that were maybe funded at the end of February, can your amount be increased to use this new calculation as well? Unfortunately, the SBA has confirmed with us that they are not going to allow any increases for a PPP loan as long as it's been dispersed. So what that means is if you've signed your closing documentation and received your money, there's no possibility to increase. Talking to our state and local SBA reps, we'd really been hopeful that they would allow us to do this for borrowers, because we know for a lot of folks it does make a big difference, increasing their loan amount. And so if you have an approval, you can still change it if you haven't accepted the money yet. And so we're going to be reaching out to everyone within our pipelines just to make sure that we qualify you for as much as possible. And so if the money has been accepted, though, no changes are able to be made. Another question is, if I don't file a Schedule C return, are there any differences in this new loan calculation? At this time, there are no other changes. So this only relates to borrowers who file a Schedule C tax return. And so if you use an 1120S, a 1065 return, anything different like that, or if you're qualifying with 941s, it doesn't change anything there. So there were some people that were interested to say, okay, can I now count income from my 1120S or distributions from an 1120S? Unfortunately, there are no changes there. And so only people using a Schedule C return. If you're qualifying with 941s, the process is largely going to remain unchanged. That's the bulk of the content that I had to go through. There've probably been some questions that have been popping up in the chat already. If you have other things I didn't cover, if they're related to the content I went over, or even maybe a little bit more generally involved in the PPP process, we're happy to take those now. Rachel, if you're willing, would you want to read a question or two off?
Sure. So we only have one question right now that hasn't been answered, I think, and that is this one. I've completed my application and I'm ready to move forward with the process. What do I need to do? I did receive an email about you all waiting until the 15th to finish processing my application.
Yeah, so I'm guessing this was someone that received the email yesterday. Rachel, did we request that they respond by the 15th on there?
Correct.
Yeah, so what was happening there is we wanted you to get back to us by the 15th. Now that you've filled out that form, we're going to start moving it forward at this time. There's not going to be a delay to it. The only reason we had the date of the 15th on there is we were a little bit worried of, okay, what if we send this out, this new updated application form and someone doesn't get back to us or it goes to their junk email? We wanted to have some timeline of saying, okay, if you don't let us know by the 15th, we'll move it forward without any changes. So as long as you've submitted that, our team is probably actively working on it right now, and we'll be in touch if we need anything or with any updates.
Cool. Another question is from someone who said their line 31 shows negative 25,000 and line 7 is negative 8,000.
Line 7 is negative 8,000. And so that seems a little surprising to me as far as negatives, negative gross income. Rachel, can you think of any reason that might be happening?
I mean, I can pull up a Schedule C form really quick, but it's actually, I've seen it several times. It's not terribly uncommon.
Okay, got it. So in that instance, unfortunately, even with the new calculation, we are only able to work off line 7 or line 31. And so if you're negative, unfortunately, you're still going to not be eligible there.
Another question, if we have never applied for PPP, are we applying for first draw application only? Also, can I include my EIDL for forgiveness with the new PPP application?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can apply for a first draw now. I'd encourage you to do that quickly. Get in line for that. The EIDL refinance workflow is actually really strange. That only counts if you received your EIDL funds in your bank account prior to April 3rd of 2020. So That's a very small subsection of people because it needs to be related to the COVID-19 outbreak, one of the economic impact disaster loans there. And what they essentially said is if you received EIDL before PPP was even released, there is a fairly convoluted workflow to refinance that. That's not something we've done a lot internally. Also, usually when I've gotten that request, EIDL was a tricky program for people to navigate early on. And so one other thing to differentiate between is the EIDL loan versus the EIDL advance or grant, as some people might have referred to it as. But so an EIDL advance was between $1,000 and $10,000. Usually if you said you had eight employees, they gave you $8,000. That doesn't need to be repaid regardless. An EIDL loan is typically larger. And it's typically going to be like $30,000, $40,000, maybe more in some instances. If you receive that prior to April 3rd of 2020 and it was in your account by that point, it's possible you can refinance some of that. It does end up sometimes decreasing your PPP loan amount a little bit. It gets kind of finicky, but if you have any questions about that, once you've applied, talk it through with your loan officer. If you received your funds April 4th or later, it does not apply in your instance though.
Next question, is the SBA still using 2.5? I'm assuming they mean that for the 2.5 times the monthly average payroll. And then can you give me an example of how the calculation is done?
Yeah, absolutely. So the calculation, you can find that online. The SBA has some kind of tedious documents you can work through there. If we're using a Schedule C tax return, if you don't have any employees, what you do is take either line 7 or line 31. For most folks, you're going to want to use line 7. It's going to help you get approved for more. You'll divide that by 12, and then you'll multiply by 2.5. So usually the multiplication factor is by 2.5. The only difference is for restaurants currently. And so if you're a restaurant or involved in food service directly, it's
or accommodations.
Or accommodations. Yeah, thank you, Rachel. You can use a 3.5. We'll determine that on our end. And so for example, a borrower, yeah, so you'll use line 7 there. If you have wages as well, so not money paid to independent contractors, but maybe you file a 941 form, which is the quarterly tax statement there, you can include your monthly average as well. The good thing is our application online does walk you through this. It makes it pretty straightforward, so we can help out with that as well. So I'd usually recommend go to the application, do your best to fill in the boxes correctly, and we'll reach out if we need to make any tweaks to it once we look it over.
It's also important to note that the 3.5 calculation for restaurants and accommodation industries, that is only for a second draw PPP application. That does not work for their first draw.
Good catch. Yeah, thank you, Rachel.
Yep. Next one, should I reply to the email and say I'm not interested in amending my application?
Yeah, so if you don't want to make the changes, what you do is you go in there, you'll click the link that's provided, and at the first page, there's a little drop down that says, I want to stick with my old application. Essentially, you'll just say no, that you don't want to change it. After that, it'll give you a button to submit and it'll just skip the rest of the form. So it literally takes 15 to 30 seconds to do that. So once you do that, it puts your application right back where it was previously with no changes involved.
Next question, if we are waiting for the first loan, how do we start a new request for the second?
Yeah, so what we're going to be doing there, like I mentioned, you don't want to accept that too early. What's going to happen is that the SBA will say that you haven't used all the funds. If you're a sole proprietor, especially, they want you to wait between 8 and 10 weeks between when you get your money for your first loan and when you accept the money for your second. And so we'll be contacting you directly. We don't want to make the application process quite as tricky as it is the first time. We want to make it a little bit easier because, for example, we already have most of your documentation on file. We're probably going to have fewer questions to ask you. So what I would do is watch for an email. We'll be sending those out in the next week or two to start that process. What that'll probably look like is we'll work to get an approval for you first, but then we'll disperse once you've confirmed that you've used all the money for that first draw loan, because we just don't want to cause any problems for your forgiveness request later, because a PPP loan that's not forgiven isn't nearly as helpful as one that is.
Next question I might actually take. It says, if my gross income is less than 4,000, would I still be qualified? So this answer is yes, you would still qualify for a PPP loan. What's challenging is that I did a quick calculation of what it would, what you'd qualify for if it was 4,000 exactly. and the amount you'd qualify for would be about $833. Our institution's minimum is $1,000 for the loan size for PPP that we work on. And we're, one of the institutions out there doing the smallest loans. So it's really tricky to find somewhere that would work on the PPP loan if it's less than $1,000 that you'd qualify for. What I would recommend is that I'm going to put my email in the chat. Send me an email, and we're going to talk a little bit more directly about this. I'll see if there's a way that we can look at this. I just can't make any promises until I get some more information from you. So look out for my email address in the chat function and we'll chat more. Next question, Kevin. Let's see here. Someone said, I calculated my loan amount by using line 7 in my original application. In this case, should I not worry about the amendment to the loan amount?
Yeah, and that's a good question because like a week or two ago, they announced that there's going to be this change. What's different is the form itself is different. So the version you filled out online is not eligible for that line 7 use. I personally kind of hoped they were just going to let us use the old form. Right now, you do need to fill out that little amendment doc that you were sent yesterday. It is just a couple of minutes. You're not going to upload anything. It's just going to ask you to enter line 7 from your return, say you want to update things, and then initial some new boxes. So go through, click into your email, fill out the new amendment, and we'll keep it moving forward.
The next question is, I take it the application I have submitted will be declined. Not sure how well we can answer that without a little more context.
I'm guessing on that. Maybe they heard something as far as the eligibility I went over or the loan calculation. Maybe this is the person that had the negative line 7. What we'll do, regardless, our team's going to review it. One of our technical assistance team will probably end up with a file and they'll reach out to you. If you're not eligible, they'll try and explain why and get in touch with you. And in those instances, we are going to try and let you know of any other local resources we're aware of as well, because maybe PPP isn't something you fit with, but maybe we're aware of some other opportunities in your state and location we can direct you towards.
All right. And this is a follow-up for the person who had a question about the EIDL refinance. It says, yes, we did receive EIDL before PPP existed, following the timeline that you said.
Got it. So what you should do if they have not applied yet, go ahead and apply. In this instance, we're going to need to kind of figure out the logistics of that. I'm happy to engage in that and see what we can do as far as that refinance chunk. When your loan officer reaches out to you, just let them know that, hey, I'm trying to refinance a portion of EIDL. Kevin had mentioned this in the webinar, and they should be able to reach out to me with that.
And that is the last question we've got at this point.
Perfect. Well, unless we see something come through in the next second or two here, I just want to thank everyone for hopping on the call today. I hope these updates were helpful. We are doing our best to keep up with volume. This week, these kind of changes that have come out have put us a little bit more behind, but team's working hard, working long hours, and we're going to make sure that we get your request processed as quickly and smoothly as we possibly can. So thank you so much for your patience and for hopping on today. Have a great afternoon.